thank you for the invitation, and I would like to thank the Academic Council for Culture and Foreign Policy, and of course the Center for Cultural and Journal Studies, and Dr. Zimmer and Professor Robertson von Trotter to invite me to come to Stuttgart. It's the first time that I'm in contact with these two organizations. It's a quite provocative title, if not for democracy for what? And it's a problematic title too. So in political science, the topic of civil society and civil society organizations used to be closely linked to research on transition. The third wave of democratization, as outlined by Samuel Huntington, indicated a major shift in global order. There were big hopes affiliated with the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the end of dictatorship in many South American countries, and with a trend towards democratic governance in Africa. So civil society was perceived to be both a driving force for the transition and a beneficiary of the transition towards democracy. So in my talk, I will focus on this nexus between these two streams of research, civil society studies and research on transition. I will illustrate that the decoupling of these two trends has taken place. A growth of civil society does no longer translate into an advancement and further deepening of democratic rule. But if this is no longer the case, what's the role and function of civil society organizations now in settings which are no longer democratic but authoritarian and liberal, and which are non-democracies? With a focus on Poland and Hungary, I will outline how civil society organizations have more and more become under the thumb of the state. And in the summary, I will get back to the key topic in question: if not for democracy, for what? Why there are civil society organizations in non-democratic settings. And I was told to be very brief and to just have 20 minutes or about a quarter of an hour, so I try to keep to the time. When we compare the world of 1977 with the world of 2017, we easily see that Huntington was right. A big shift in favor of democratic rule has taken place in the last 2 decades. While democracy was hardly present in Asia and Africa, and also of minor importance in South America in the 17th, there is a different situation in 2017. However, the map also shows that there are many gray zones, countries that are rated as being autocratic, mixed, or they're even not rated at all. Particularly these countries and their regimes are of key interest when we talk about shrinking spaces for civil society organizations. Also, the most recent developments, the strong trends towards populism and illiberal democracy, particularly in Europe, are not yet considered. They are not shown on that map. Scholarly work in the social sciences has reflected the changing world order. In the 19th, transition research started to boom and peaked at the turn of the last century. Actually, the same holds true for civil society studies and non-profit research. In the 19th, the concept of civil society increasingly gained popularity among politicians such as Václav Havel or Romano Prodi, who served as the president of the EU Commission in the early 2000s. However, today political science is on the alert. The grey zones of the map, the unclear cases that are neither democracies nor straightforward autocracies, have moved into scholarly attention. Now, the research focus is primarily on so-called hybrid regimes that stand in between democratic rule and autocracy. Very often these regimes are an outcome of an incomplete democratic transition. So what does this mean now for civil society studies? And what does this mean for the role and function of civil society organizations when the triumphal march towards democracy stumbles or even seem to have come to an end? Scholars who have and were engaged in both civil society studies and transition research have identified three kind of distinct periods of government-civil society relations in the so-called transition countries of the 19th that started to move from autocracy to more liberal modes of governance. The first one is a period when CSO were thoroughly in opposition to the ruling undemocratic state. Civil society provided the alternative vis-à-vis an unjust and authoritarian government. The second period is the so-called liberal period, in which the relationship was somehow unclear, but supportive and liberal in the sense of open for experiments. Civil society was perceived as a partner on the road towards a market economy and a more pluralistic society. And now we are in the third period, characterized by changing and shrinking spaces for civil society. Let me briefly go through the different periods. Some of us might remember the early 2080s, when the news reported the first strikes of Solidarność in Poland. At the yard in Danzig, the strikes were organized by Lech Wałęsa, who was to become the new president of Poland under democratic rule in 1990. At that time, civil society was the driving force for democratization. And the claim for liberty and democracy was a social movement supported by thousands of citizens in the countries of the former Soviet bloc. This period was indeed peak time for civil society worldwide, as the international Comparative Johns Hopkins non-profit sector project proved statistically. Civil society organization mushroomed and increasingly cooperated with government, also in countries that were and are still autocracies, such as, for instance, China or Vietnam. Lester Salomon talked about an associational revolution that took place worldwide. Indeed, governments of countries in transition and those still under one-party rule began to acknowledge the existence of organizations neither belonging to the state nor to the market. The introduction of legal forms for non-profits indicated an important step forward. Also, foreign funding for civil society organizations was accepted and even welcomed and helped to establish a civil society non-profit sector in the countries in transition. The work of the Soros Foundation in East Europe, and particularly in Hungary, the engagement of the German political foundations and other intermediaries, such as the Goethe Institutes, are examples for both successful international cooperation and also for the openness of the countries in transition for new initiatives at that time. However, this period was also a time with room for a lot of experiments, a situation similar to a lab setting of which the outcome was not clear. Retrospectively, political science might have been too optimistic and too constrained by wishful thinking. Already at the beginning of the 2000s, Thomas Carothers, an expert on international support for democracy working for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, indicated in a famous article that there might be an end to the transition paradigm. He talked about a significant shift or even a reversion of the worldwide trend towards democracy. He proclaimed that transition has come to a halt, stagnated, or even moved backwards. Since then, we talk about civil societies shrinking or changing spaces. We are concerned about the development in East Europe, in China, in Russia, and even in the old democracies such as the United States or Great Britain. According to the classification of the Civicus map rating, we see narrowed spaces for civil societies. Here there might be violations of the right of assembly, the freedom of the media. There might be harassment or assault of people, but this is not the rule. Then there are obstructed spaces. Here, civil space is heavily contested by power holders who impose a combination of legal and practical constraints on the full enjoyment of fundamental rights. And they are repressed spaces. Civic space is significantly constrained in these areas. You might see the different colors, and then you can figure out where we talk about. But how does it work? How does government manage to narrow or to obstruct the space for civil society and its organizations? A key tool is the control of funding. This works in two ways. First, government obstructs international funding legally. It has become very difficult, if not impossible, to transfer money from abroad to CSOs working, for instance, in Russia, in Israel, in China, or Hungary. Second, government sets up special funds earmarked for CSOs working in specific areas and/or standing for a specific normative orientation. A fine example is the Presidential Fund in Russia. Also, government opens or restricts fundraising. For instance, in China, there is a distinction between foundations eligible for public or general fundraising and those that are only allowed to tap on private funds. The further important instruments of control are the modes of registration. If a CSO is not registered, it is illegal. In China, the majority of CSOs are not registered. Registration is very costly in this country. In China, CSOs need a sparring partner in the government. They are under the control of the Ministry of the Interior. Also, a chapter of the Communist Party has to be installed, at least one member of the party within the organization. Softer mechanisms of control encompass preferential treatment for those CSOs that stand for a specific ideological or normative orientation. For instance, in Russia, CSO might be very close to the Orthodox Church. The organization might be very much in favor of nationalistic or patriotic ideas and perspectives. It might be very close to the Catholic Church in Poland, and it might be very much against gender equality and hence in favor of a paternalistic society. Finally, a tough and straightforward tool is to declare that a CSO or persons affiliated with the organizations operate illegally. That's particularly what the particular CSO is doing is then declared to be against the law. What the individuals are doing is declared to endanger national security. Hence, CSOs and their leaders are by law criminalized. Before I come to my summary, I briefly want to refer to Poland and Hungary as two case studies of neighboring countries and EU members where the space for civic engagement in CSOs has become narrower since populist parties came to power. So without repeating the whole story, the three distinct periods of government-CSO relations are very recognizable in Poland, where today we indeed encounter a situation of a shrinking space for certain CSOs and societal developments. Also, the identified tools to control and to keep CSO under the thumb of the state are easily to detect in Poland. The love for organizations being very, very close to the Catholic Church and the harsh control of organizations fighting for women's lib and equal rights are well known and legendary. Government officials also use culture as a soft power with the goal of propelling patriotic, nationalistic and patriarchal ideas. This has an impact on the media, the program and staffing of cultural institutions, as well as on schooling as the core of education. We will see how this trend is going to continue and will have an impact on cultural relations. It is quite unclear which country is more affected by the new wave of putting policies in place that contradict the spirit and the very foundations of democracy, Poland or Hungary. According to Eva Kuti, a senior scholar and civil society researcher who participated in the Johns Hopkins project in the early 19th, democratization and decentralization processes have been reversed in Hungary. Again, we find the repertoire of instruments and techniques that are used worldwide to control and regulate CSOs and that are applied to criminalize civil society organizations and civic activists in Hungary. So herewith, I would like to come back to my initial question. If not for democracy, for what? So empirical research tells us there is no reduction of non-profit or civil society organization in numbers. On the contrary, in many non-democratic countries, such as in China, the foundation boom of CSO goes on and even accelerates. However, the areas of activity change. The space for becoming active becomes more limited. The NPSO sector becomes less plural. There are more organizations working in the social domain and far less being engaged in core civil society domains such as human rights, gender issues, or the protection of the environment, which is a highly disputed arena of CSO activity, for instance, in Russia. So, what are the prime tasks of CSO in non-democratic settings? All in all, CSO do not work on behalf of the advancement of democracy in these regimes. Instead, their prime task is to keep illiberal governments and autocratic rulers in power by providing public social services and hence by at least indirectly supporting the legitimacy of the regime. That brings me to my last idea and final topic. I mean, it is worthwhile continuing to work in these countries. This is a more empirical question we would like to encounter with the book project. Does it make sense to still believe in the strength of civil society, or would it be better to pull out of these countries? We try to get together a range of authors, scholars, and practitioners with a background in research or working abroad in countries suffering from defective democracy, one-party governments, and from the dangers of populism. Our goal is to enhance a discussion on the topic of how to go further and to give up the idea of democratic rule in civil society, even in these times when more and more countries seem to fall in love with nationalism, populism, and non-democratic governance. I think personally we shouldn't give this up, and thank you for your attention.